July 4th, 1187. A day that would not just change the course of history, but would send shockwaves through the very foundations of Christianity in the East. The scorching heat of the desert, the smell of fear, and the blood-drenched earth near the Sea of Galilee would bear witness to a battle so brutal that its impact would shatter the Crusader dream in the Holy Land. The Crusaders, who had long held their power through strength and savagery, were about to face tactics unlike any the movies ever portrayed. For nearly a century, the Crusaders had carved out their kingdoms in the Middle East, driven by their belief in divine conquest and the promise of salvation through holy war. Jerusalem, their shining jewel, had stood as the symbol of Christian might, the epicenter of their dreams of empire. Yet beneath the surface of this symbol of power, cracks were already beginning to show. The Christian kingdom was crumbling, not from an external enemy, but from internal decay. Infighting and corruption had seeped into the very core of the Crusader states. Leadership was fractured, and rivalries were constant. Political factions jostled for control, and personal vendettas took precedence over strategic planning. Even the Christian knights, once known for their discipline and unity, had begun to lose sight of their original mission. Their leaders were often more concerned with power struggles and political gain than with maintaining the unity and strength needed to defend their territory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, the Muslims, led by the brilliant and ruthless Saladin, were undergoing a transformation of their own. Saladin was not just a warlord, he was a visionary, a strategist who understood the power of unity, faith, and psychological warfare. By 1187, he had united the fractured Muslim world under his banner, building an empire from Egypt to Mesopotamia, and leading a coalition that would prove to be the most formidable threat the Crusaders had ever faced. Saladin was a master of political manipulation and warfare, carefully positioning himself as the defender of Islam against the Crusaders, framing the conflict as not just a territorial dispute, but as a holy war to reclaim Jerusalem from foreign invaders. His ability to frame the Crusades as a religious cause galvanized the Muslim world, uniting warriors from across the Middle East under a single, unyielding banner. The Crusaders, who had long benefited from a divided Muslim world, now faced a single, unified enemy with a singular goal to reclaim the Holy Land. This time, the Crusaders were not facing isolated Muslim emirates. They were up against a cohesive, organized, and highly motivated force. Saladin's vision and leadership posed a threat that the Crusaders were ill-prepared to counter. They had underestimated his ability to unite the Muslim world and create an army that was as disciplined as it was relentless. On July 3, 1187, the Crusaders made a fateful mistake. They marched headlong into a trap so expertly laid by Saladin that it is often dismissed as pure fate. In reality, it was the culmination of months of careful planning and strategic positioning by Saladin's forces. Saladin knew the Crusaders would be forced to march toward Tiberias, and he had meticulously prepared for it. Saladin's forces had already cut off the Crusaders' access to water, weakening them even before the first arrow was fired. The Crusader army, numbering around 16,000 men, including 300 mounted knights and 15,000 infantry, moved forward through the rugged terrain of Galilee. But as they pressed onward, the heat of the desert began to take its toll. The knights were encased in heavy armor, making their progress slow and agonizing. Their horses, too, were fatigued and struggling to carry the weight of their riders. The terrain was unforgiving, and every step forward felt like another strike against their dwindling morale. In addition to the physical toll, the Crusaders were being harassed by Saladin's cavalry. Light and fast, these troops struck at the Crusader flanks and rear, loosing arrows and disappearing into the hills before the Crusaders could react. The constant harassment, combined with the relentless heat, began to break the Crusaders' will. Their once pristine military discipline was slowly eroding as they began to feel the full weight of their predicament. By the time they reached the Horns of Hattin on July 4th, the Crusaders were utterly exhausted. They were trapped between two hills, with no way to escape. The Sea of Galilee lay tantalizingly close, but the Crusaders couldn't reach it. Saladin's forces had positioned themselves strategically to control every water source, creating a siege without walls. It was a masterstroke of military strategy. What made Saladin's tactics so devastating was his understanding of psychological warfare. He didn't just break his enemies physically, he broke them mentally. The Crusaders were trapped, suffocating in the heat, parched and desperate for water, with no hope of escape. Saladin's forces kept up the pressure with calculated precision, targeting the Crusaders' weaknesses and exploiting them. Saladin's army was well supplied, regularly rotated, and intimately familiar with the terrain. The Crusaders, on the other hand, were disorganized, tired, and crippled by thirst. The mental toll of the situation was immense. The Crusaders, once proud and confident, were now broken men, their spirits shattered by the relentless pursuit of Saladin's forces. The battle had already been won before the first sword was raised. As the Crusaders struggled to hold their ground, Saladin set fire to the dry grass surrounding their camp. The thick, choking smoke added to the misery, making it even harder for the Crusaders to breathe and see. It was a symbol of the inescapable doom that awaited them. Saladin's forces then unleashed a barrage of arrows, striking from a distance and picking apart the Crusaders' ranks with devastating efficiency. The Crusaders, who had relied on close combat and heavy cavalry in the past, were helpless against this new form of warfare. They were powerless to stop the rain of arrows, and the terrain offered no refuge. The Crusaders were trapped in every sense of the word, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The Battle of Hattin wasn't just a military engagement, it was an annihilation. As Saladin's forces closed in, the Crusaders' desperation reached its peak. King Guy of Jerusalem and his knights, in a final act of defiance, charged into the Muslim lines, hoping to break free. But the terrain was unforgiving, and the cavalry was weak from dehydration and exhaustion. The charges were futile, each one ending in catastrophe. The Christian infantry, driven mad by thirst and fear, broke ranks and scattered. They fled in every direction, hoping for a chance to reach the water that lay just beyond their reach. But there was no escape. By the end of the day, more than 15,000 Crusaders lay dead or captured. Only a handful of knights managed to escape. The rest, broken, defeated, and humiliated, had no choice but to kneel before their captors. Saladin's treatment of the prisoners was cold and calculated. The Christian lords, including King Guy, were spared, but they were kept alive only for future negotiations. They were valuable as hostages, tools to be used in future diplomatic efforts. But not everyone was spared. Reynold of Chech-Tillon, the man responsible for violating the truce by attacking Muslim pilgrims, faced a brutal end. Saladin personally executed him, his sword a symbol of both vengeance and justice. It was a stark reminder that Saladin was not just a military leader, he was a ruler who understood the power of retribution. The military orders, such as the Knights Templar, did not fare as well. These warrior monks, sworn to fight against Islam, were executed without mercy. Saladin's justice was swift and uncompromising, sending a clear message to both his enemies and his own followers that betrayal and dishonor would not be tolerated. In the days that followed, Saladin's forces rolled through the Holy Land like a tidal wave. City after city fell to his army, and the Crusaders had nothing left to defend themselves with. Acre, Sidon, Jaffa, each city a blow to Christian pride. The Crusader kingdom was crumbling, and Jerusalem was the final prize. On October 2, 1187, just 3 months after the Battle of Hattin, the gates of Jerusalem opened to Saladin's forces. The city that had once been the heart of Christian power was lost. Saladin's victory was not just a military triumph, it was a psychological blow that shattered the Crusaders' belief in their own invincibility. The Battle of Hattin was more than just a military defeat. It was the death of an era. The Crusaders would never again hold the same power in the East. Saladin's victory shifted the balance of power in the region permanently. The psychological toll on Christian Europe was immense. The Pope reportedly died upon hearing the news of the defeat, a testament to the shock and disbelief that reverberated across Christendom. While the Third Crusade, led by figures like Richard the Lionheart, would regain some territory, Jerusalem was lost forever. The Crusaders would never again have the same military dominance they once enjoyed. Saladin's brilliance in warfare, politics, and human nature had undone nearly a century of Crusader victories in a single campaign. The Battle of Hattin stands as one of history's most decisive engagements. It wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the death of an empire. Saladin's brilliance was not just in his military tactics, but in his ability to manipulate the political landscape, unite his forces, and understand the psychological nature of warfare. The Crusaders' defeat wasn't just about weapons. It was about strategy, unity, and an opponent who knew how to fight not just with swords, but with the mind. What Hollywood doesn't show is that Saladin's greatest weapon wasn't his army, but his mind. It was his ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and break his enemies before they even stepped onto the battlefield. The Crusaders' most brutal defeat came not just from the clash of swords, but from the brilliance of Saladin's tactics. The Crusaders never recovered. And with that, the dream of a permanent Christian foothold in the Islamic world was shattered forever.